welcome to our virtual stage, the fantastic Johannes and Volker. So if we can please put our hands together for these two wonderful individuals while Johannes shares his screen, and I shall hand it over to the two of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, and Johannes, you might be on the old mute button.
Sorry about that. Thanks,
Perfect.
Sarah. Yep. I was ready to start with an introduction, but I think you've got our bios on the website, right?
Yep.
So in very short order, I'm an environmental engineer with a history of leading multidisciplinary teams. And I wanted to talk today about my experience in consensus building and to introduce my business partner, Volker, as well, to a systemic consensing decision-making method that was invented by Volker's business. And we're working together to bring this more and more to the mining industry and elsewhere. And I think it's relevant because, as the conference says, we need to agree common objectives, respect each other enough to explore assumptions and options, and make timely decisions if we're going to make this transition and if we're going to have the raw materials to do so. And hopefully by this process, we can also sow some seeds of trust. So then, a little word about what we believe facilitation is. Okay, so facilitating means supporting a group of people to achieve their goals. So normally as facilitators, we try to be independent within a change process, a workshop, a project, or a meeting. Typically for me, over the course of my career, it's involved establishing a framework or a structure. Perhaps sometimes it required gaining top management support for the group so that they could feel empowered to decide. It requires active, reflective listening, cultural awareness, keen observation also of body language, and often some amount of translation between disciplines, like Sarah, you mentioned, between maybe the economic theologist and the social scientist. And often enough in my career, I have found myself seemingly translating, I joke and say, translating from English to English. And I think it's part of that reflective listening, just to make sure that even if I think I've understood the participant, maybe some assistance is required to make sure the rest of the room understands the participant. And sometimes the facilitation team may build a unique overview of the topic or the issues at hand. And depending on the topic, depending on the context, that the facilitation team might develop that view, but not be in a position to unilaterally reveal that view to individual participants. So facilitation can become quite a privileged role. And in that sense, the facilitator needs to be trusted. So then I think I'll hand over to Volker and he'll explain a little bit more about the method that we use to facilitate these decisions.
Thank you. Systemic consensus is a decision-making process, and its goal is to find a solution that is sustainable and that is can be accepted by everybody who has participated in this process. So it's not about, like we sometimes know, find a big group that says yes and the other group has to accept. No, it's about finding a solution that can be accepted by all the participants. And it's a systemic innovation. And what I want to explain that most of the decision-making processes we know weren't designed. They just grew. They were suddenly there, and then now we use them in all our contexts as we know. And some of them have a very bad systemic impact on the behavior of the group. And what do I mean with the word systemic? I have these two pictures here. One is from a soccer game and the other one is from figure skating. People align their behavior to the success criteria of the system they are in. So this is why you have never seen figure skaters spit on the ground, because they are judged, or their success criteria is to be elegant. On the other side, the soccer player, he's only judged by shooting more goals than the other team. It's the only thing is that's his success criteria, and all his behavior is aligned and focused on this thing. So if we have systems in which our success criteria, and the only success criteria, I'm now referring to the majority vote, is find a bigger group behind you than any other group, and then you're successful, our whole behavior is aligning to this. And this is what we can see in the politics and everywhere where majority vote is used. This is the behavior of the people. And it's not find the best solutions for all, because it's not my success criteria. My success criteria is find a bigger group behind me. And by changing this success criterion to something else, so what we do in systemic consensing is we measure resistance, find a solution nobody has resistance against, so they can all live with it. They have to change their behavior to a totally different, open to consensus, open to listening to the needs of others. Because if I don't put your needs in my solution, you will have resistance against my solution. So it's totally changing the way people behave, and we are not kind of oh, please, you good boys and good girls, please behave. No, if you want to be successful, you will behave this way, and this is a big change. And this is why it's a systemic innovation, and it's a new kind of putting forward solutions that come close to consensus. Yeah, this is back to you, Johannes.
Thank you. And I wanted to explain that this is a real life experience that we have when facilitating these groups. And my most recent experience was with a colleague of ours facilitating a decision process within the Global Battery Alliance. And it was very obvious that in setting the framework, the behavior of the participants changed. When you think about it, if you give any sort of slightly competitive activity amongst children or families, people immediately want to understand the rules. I know that when my 11-year-old says, can we play this big elaborate game, I straight away ask them, what are the rules? And that's because people are trying to decide how will they behave? How will they behave in that activity? And we have observed this also in the Global Battery Alliance. Individual participants wish to understand particularly how the final decision will be. What are the rules of the game that they're in? And very often human beings will look for ways to game the system to their advantage. They'll try to exploit something within the rules to give them some advantage in the decision making. Like Volker mentioned, if it's majority rule, well, I just lobby some people to get a larger group. Sometimes it can mean that they've misunderstood their context. For example, a very ruthless assembling of a majority to make a decision that leaves a minority feeling hardly done by, that could be hard enough to break a relationship. So sometimes people need to be reminded that might not be in their interest. They may be seeking a longer term relationship, and so then they should think a little more about how hard to push the rules. But then, as Volker explained, if we set the rules so that this human tendency can be gainfully employed, then we can actually start to align incentives. This is something else that I think we saw from the previous discussion, where the human behavior, the desire to succeed, the desire to do well in the activity can naturally align. For example, if the combined objective is to lower the overall resistance to the decision being made. Volker, I think you can explain to us why.
Why do we measure resistance? So I will start with here I see a quote from my father: respect for a human being is shown in the respect for his or her no. So this is one thing we believe in. If somebody says no and you don't respect this no, you don't respect a person at all. So this is really, you can see it in this. But I want to put forward another quote I heard from a very famous trainer for nonviolent communication. He once said, aggression is a strategy that people choose when they are afraid that their needs will not be met. So resistance is always a hint for a need that hasn't been met. And if my needs aren't to be fulfilled, or I'm in a context where I'm in fear that my needs are not fulfilled, I start to put forward fighting or something else strategies, kind of. So normally we go back to what's in English, stem brain stem, where only fight and flight is active. And when the stem brain is active, the parts of the brain that are used for social interaction or creativity, they cannot be active at the same time. So you're in a fight mode and not in a creative mode. And if you're in a system that says, hey, your resistance, your no is important to us, and we will always have a look at this, and we will try our best to fulfill your needs. This is our systemic goal. People start to change their behavior. They start to relax. They come in a state to be more creative. I also heard once a trainer, he said the main thing a facilitator should do, he should provide a safe environment. When we were 1,000 years ago, always one was standing there and having watched that no wild animal would come and eat us, so the others could relax. And this is kind of the role of a facilitator, to make sure that you others can relax, because only in relaxed states you can be creative and open to consensus and open to social interaction. So we put a whole system around this that will focus on providing a safe space in which your needs, the goal is that the needs of all the participants should be met. This is our goal, and this is the basis for our decision. And this changes the whole process of decision making. Johannes.
Right, so I really want to leave some time so that people can quiz us. So I'll just wrap up with some familiar diagrams for some. These are attempts that the industry's made in the past to define social license to operate. And I think that literature tells us that establishing trust is not a one-step process. It's a step-by-step process, and there might even be some prerequisites that need to be established before you can establish trust. And when in this systemic consensing method, of course, the proof has to come in the pudding. So once the decision is made, and what we generally see is that once a decision is made with systemic consensing, minimizing resistance to that decision, the proof is in the implementation. So if everyone is on board, everyone has been heard, everyone has had their resistance dealt with, it's maybe not a complete lack of resistance, but at least minimized resistance, there's much better chance that people will buy into that decision, they will stand for that decision, and they will contribute to implementing that decision. And then when you start to establish a track record of the group, that's when you can establish credibility of yourself as individuals, credibility of the process, and start perhaps to establish some of the seeds of trust. And then I'm very keen to field any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Johannes and Volker, for that. We're going to give you a round of applause to say thank you, just straight off the bat, because I think that was a fantastic talk. And also, I guess, building on what we've heard earlier on today, be it from Robin on that listening perspective or that side of things, and then Priscilla digging into one of those key areas within the mining sector that has had huge problems with regards to that. So Johannes and Volker, with regards to the techniques that you've been sharing with us here today, so you've been applying them within the battery passport, is that correct, Johannes? And then how about with regards to the broader, say, the European context? Because Europe is really interesting in that there's not a huge amount of mining that goes on. but there's quite a lot of social sentiment with regards to the mining sector. So Johannes, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, just to say that I agree with you that there's huge potential, and maybe you've guessed at one of my motivations for really starting to develop this side of our service offering. So Volker and our partner Dominic are very experienced in providing this sort of services in the German-speaking world, and now we're teaming up to provide an English format for this, and especially see a large market for this in the multi-stakeholder groups that inevitably meet in places like Brussels and Paris and Geneva to deal with some of these issues and try to develop documents or develop decisions, etc., etc. But eventually, if you really wanted to be creative and brave and innovative, you could imagine bringing such processes into committees of Parliament, for example, because the Parliament has its own rules that drives its own behaviours. A certain number of those rules are based on a majority vote. But you might even be able to carve out a sandbox or a space where you say, okay, in this context, for this negotiation, we are going to apply resistance rating, systemic consenting, see if we can't get to a better amendment or a better compromise. So that's a long way off, but there is application for this in the political sphere, and I know that they've done, my colleagues have done some work in the political sphere in Austria. Volker, if you want to add. It looks like
he might have frozen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, in Austria and in the German-speaking world, kind of, we are working.
Keep going, Volker. On you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. On you go. You're just a little bit cyborg.
In the German-speaking world. Okay, I'm sorry. We already got some villages really using the method of systemic consensus for their whole decision taking, really on a political level. So in Austria, we already have experience with this.
And so with this, do you find that, because again, Johannes, going back to that kind of that macro perspective and thinking about this in parliaments, etc., where you've got lots of different cultures coming together, do you find that this form of understanding and listening, etc., works better in some cultures than others, or do you find that you just have to push it a little bit further when you've got multiple different cultures coming together? Does that make any sense?
It makes sense. It's a fair question. The answer I would give is I suspect that the human behaviours that we're tapping into here are universal. But what might be important is a culture fit between the facilitator and the main players, or at least a cultural awareness so that the facilitator can help people to bridge these cultural differences. And that does take time. So this method is adaptable. We can compress it. If you need to make a decision, Sarah, by the end of tomorrow, we can take you through a much more rigid, perhaps even a little bit directive version of the method, which nevertheless still does get people to reduce resistance. And I think some of our panelists have seen me in action in that mode. But if you really do want to take the time to better bridge cultural differences and better establish an understanding behind the resistance, then of course it's better to take more time to run that process.
Fantastic. Awesome. So thank you. There are more questions, by the way, beginning to come in. I'll try and make sure we feed them through to both of you. But Johannes, Volker, thank you so much for sharing with us today. Round of applause. Awesome. Fantastic.